The courtroom was quiet. Too quiet, some might say. You could hear the shuffle of papers, the faint scrape of chairs against the polished wood, the subtle hum of the air conditioning, almost like the building itself was holding its breath. And then he entered, Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, a man accustomed to cameras, to applause, to headlines, now walking into a courtroom where none of that mattered, not in the way he was used to. He was here, seated under the gaze of Judge Matthew Nicklin, in London's High Court, in the midst of a legal battle that was quietly, and yet unmistakably, set to redefine the boundaries of privacy, power, and what it means to be a royal in the 21st century. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But the moment that set the tone for the entire proceeding came almost immediately. A seemingly small, almost procedural point. The judge, calmly, deliberately, refused to address him as Your Highness. A refusal that sent a ripple through the courtroom, and, perhaps more tellingly, through Harry himself. Reports describe him as visibly frustrated, a flicker of something raw, something that reminded the world that beneath the composed exterior of a prince, beneath the suit, the carefully groomed hair, the practiced smile, was a man who still felt the sting of slight, of indignity, of protocol denied. Now, to many outside observers, this might seem like a trivial detail, a matter of etiquette, a minor courtroom formality. But anyone paying attention understands the deeper currents at play. Titles carry power. They carry recognition. And for a man who has spent his life navigating the labyrinth of royal protocol, public scrutiny, and personal expectation, to be stripped, even briefly, of the formal acknowledgement that defines him in the public eye is not a small thing. It is a trigger, a provocation, and, as we would soon witness, it was the spark that ignited a moment of visible fury that no one in that room would forget. The case itself is already high profile, of course. Harry is suing the publisher of the Daily Mail, alleging unlawful information gathering, accusing the newspaper and its sister publication, the Mail on Sunday, of intrusions into his private life. He claims that journalists engaged in activities that crossed legal boundaries, that private information about him and his family was gathered without consent and then exploited for profit, for sensational headlines, for stories that pried into the most intimate aspects of his existence. And yet, the publisher has not gone quietly into the night. In a statement released before the trial, they called Harry's accusations preposterous and without foundation, asserting that their reporting was the product of responsible journalism, based on legitimate sources. They highlighted that many of the stories in question were published decades ago and, critically, were not the subject of any complaint at the time. In essence, their defense is straightforward. What happened was legal, aboveboard, and simply the business of news reporting. So we have the stage set. A prince in a courtroom, confronting a media empire, a judge whose every decision carries weight, and a world watching, waiting, hungry for every slip, every exclamation, every sign of emotion. But there is more here than just a legal squabble. There is a clash of worlds, a collision of expectation and reality, a story that is at once intensely personal and profoundly emblematic of larger forces at work in society. The tension between public interest and private life, the power of titles and the fragility of recognition, the weight of history pressing against the immediacy of the present. It is worth pausing for a moment to consider what this means. A prince, a man born into privilege, trained in the rituals of public life, followed by cameras from birth, is brought face to face with a situation that strips him of the symbolic acknowledgement that defines his station. He is, for a moment, treated not as royalty but as any other witness, and the reaction is immediate, visceral. But here is the paradox. His fury is not just about himself. It is about recognition, respect, the boundaries of authority, and the sense of fairness that underpins our understanding of who should be acknowledged and how. It is about a life lived constantly under the lens, and the subtle but persistent assertion that even a prince is not untouchable. And yet, the courtroom drama, the moment of tension over a title, is just the beginning. Because behind this single point lies a cascade of issues that will define the trial. There are questions of legality. What counts as unlawful information gathering? How far can journalists go in pursuit of a story? There are questions of ethics. Should decades-old reporting, unchallenged at the time, be revisited under the weight of modern sensibilities and expectations? And there are, always, questions of power and image. How does a royal navigate a world that has been shaped by centuries of privilege but now operates under radically different cultural norms and scrutiny? Harry's legal action is not merely a matter of seeking redress. It is, in many ways, a stand against an institution, a challenge to a media culture that has, for years, trafficked in his private life. And yet, even as he asserts his claims in the courtroom, there is a broader narrative at play, one that involves the public, the press, and the subtle interplay between perception and reality. Because for all the attention given to the royal himself, the way this story unfolds will say as much about societal attitudes toward privacy, entitlement, and accountability as it does about the man at its center. Consider, for a moment, the tension of the moment, the judge refusing a royal title. Harry, bristling, the legal teams poised on either side, cameras rolling, journalists taking meticulous notes. It is quiet, it is tense, and yet it is electric. Every word, every inflection, every glance carries meaning. In this setting, the smallest details are amplified. The refusal to use a title is not a mere formality. It is a statement, an assertion of principle, a subtle yet powerful reminder that in this room, the law is sovereign and no one, not even a prince, can claim exemption. And yet, as Harry gave his testimony, as the courtroom absorbed his words and his expressions, there was a sense that the unfolding drama was only partially about what was being said. It was about how it was being received, how it was interpreted, how it would be remembered. Because in the modern age, where every gesture is recorded, every phrase dissected, and every reaction amplified, perception becomes reality. And in this case, the world would be watching to see not only whether the legal arguments held, but whether the human being behind the title, Prince Harry, son of Charles, brother of William, husband, father, would be perceived as strong, composed, wronged, or unruly. It is here, in the tension between public expectation and private experience, that the true gravity of this story lies. Because for all the headlines, the news cycles, and the social media commentary, the question is fundamentally human. How does a person, even one born into extraordinary circumstance, respond when they are denied recognition, challenged in a public forum, and confronted with the machinery of law and media that often feels impersonal, relentless, and indifferent? How does one navigate the collision of legacy, expectation, and immediate emotion? And that, ultimately, is the frame we must hold as we move into the details of this trial. The refusal to use Your Highness was not just a fleeting moment of drama. It was a lens through which the entire case can be understood. It is a microcosm of the stakes, a symbolic entry point into the broader narrative of power, privacy, and the relentless gaze of the press. Every legal argument, every objection, every piece of evidence presented in the coming weeks will echo back to this single, charged interaction. It is a reminder that in the world of public figures, the personal is inseparable from the procedural, the emotional from the legal, the human from the symbolic. But if that were all there was, if we stopped at protocol and outrage, we would miss the deeper currents. Because what happened next? How Harry navigated the testimony, how the legal teams responded, and how the courtroom itself seemed to shift under the weight of tension, would reveal fractures, contradictions, and alliances that few outside observers could anticipate. There were moments of restraint and moments of fury, moments of reflection and moments of confrontation. And each one built upon the last, a slow crescendo toward outcomes that no one in that room could fully predict. So as we begin to unpack this story, as we trace the contours of Harry's legal challenge, as we examine the interplay between royal expectation, judicial authority, and media scrutiny, it is crucial to hold in mind a single, unsettling thought. The courtroom is a stage, but the consequences extend far beyond it. Every statement, every reaction, every unspoken tension will ripple outward, shaping perceptions, influencing debates, and leaving traces that persist long after the gavel falls. And yet, despite the gravity, despite the high stakes, there remains a question that hangs over the entire proceeding, like a shadow at the edge of the frame. How far will a prince go to defend his privacy? And at what cost? Not just legally, but personally, emotionally, even symbolically? That question is not hypothetical. It is unfolding before us, in real time, in the very courtrooms of London, under the careful eyes of Judge Matthew Nicklin, and it will define the narrative for weeks to come. But as we step into the trial itself, as we follow Harry through his testimony and the push and pull of argument and objection, there is one thing that is certain. Nothing about this story will unfold in a straight line. There will be surprises. There will be contradictions. There will be moments that shock, moments that provoke, moments that make us question not only the individuals involved, but the very structures of power and accountability that surround them. And what came next, in that courtroom, set the stage for a chain of events that would ripple far beyond the walls of the High Court. A series of moments, small and large, that would reveal the complex, human, and often deeply contradictory figure of Prince Harry. The moment the judge refused the title was only the beginning. The trial had begun, and what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Did anyone in that room truly understand what they were about to witness? On paper, the trial was straightforward. Prince Harry versus a media conglomerate, allegations of unlawful information gathering, arguments over decades-old stories, and a judge tasked with steering the legal machinery of the High Court. But as soon as the courtroom doors closed, it became clear that this would be no ordinary hearing. Harry entered the witness box with the measured gait of someone trained to control appearances. His shoulders squared, his jaw set. But behind that composed exterior, there was an undercurrent. A subtle tension in his hands, a flicker of impatience in his eyes. Observers would later note the slight tightening of his posture when Judge Nicklin issued the first procedural clarifications. It was, perhaps, the first small collision between protocol and personality. And then the moment arrived. A question from counsel. The judge, deliberately precise, spoke, and the words hung in the air. "I will not refer to you as Your Highness." No fanfare. No judgment, just matter-of-fact law. And yet, for Harry, it landed like a strike. It was not about ego. At least, not entirely. It was about acknowledgement, recognition, validation of the life he had lived under constant scrutiny. It was the subtle assertion that, in this space, he was no longer the prince who commanded public attention but a witness like any other, bound to the ordinary rules of the courtroom. And that, unexpectedly, profoundly, elicited a reaction. His voice, measured at first, carried a hint of restrained indignation. His eyes darted to the legal team beside him. A flicker of frustration. A quiet tightening of lips. Pause here. Consider what this signifies. This is not a tabloid moment, not a staged outrage for cameras. This is a man grappling with the collision of personal history and procedural reality. A man accustomed to headlines, accustomed to reverence, accustomed to being noticed. And now being told, implicitly, that none of that matters within these walls. The courtroom itself became a character in the drama. The walls, lined with polished oak and ornate moldings, absorbed the tension. The benches held spectators who watched, not entirely certain whether they were witnessing legal argument or personal confrontation. Every pen scratching notes, every whisper, every subtle cough contributed to a rhythm that was as much psychological as procedural. The space itself seemed to amplify minor cues into monumental gestures. And what of the allegations themselves? Harry's case was carefully constructed, with claims that the publisher had either carried out or commissioned unlawful activities. But unlawful is never a simple word in a courtroom. It carries weight. It carries ambiguity. It demands proof. The onus was on Harry to demonstrate that the newspaper's pursuit of information had crossed a legal boundary. Not just a moral one, not just an ethical one, but a boundary codified in law. And yet, the publisher's pre-trial statement hinted at the strategy that would unfold in the coming weeks. They framed their reporting as responsible journalism based on legitimate sources. They emphasized the age of the stories, some published more than 2 decades ago. They pointed out that no complaint had been lodged at the time. In effect, they were saying, "Yes, we reported on your life, but we did so legally, without transgression. And, implicitly, if no one complained then, why now?" But that argument overlooks something subtle and significant. Time does not erase the impact of intrusion. Information obtained decades ago still shapes lives, still informs perception, still leaves traces that persist. And for Harry, those traces were personal, intimate, sometimes painful. The legal lens may frame it in abstract terms. Unauthorized acquisition of information, breaches of privacy, journalistic boundaries, but the human reality is far less tidy. Every article, every headline, every exposure of private moments represents a violation of self that cannot simply be dismissed as history. And here, a question arises for the audience. How do we measure harm when legality and morality diverge? Is it enough that the law might not consider decades-old reporting a violation? Or does the enduring emotional and psychological impact create a realm of accountability beyond the statutes? The trial, after all, is not simply about what is legal on paper. It is about the collision of law, power, and lived experience. As Harry began his testimony, the courtroom watched him carefully navigate this terrain. He recounted incidents with precision. He described moments of intrusion, stories that exposed private struggles, and the sense of violation that followed. And yet, there was a notable restraint in his delivery. Not every reaction was raw. Not every emotion was unguarded. There was a rhythm to the testimony, measured statements punctuated by subtle inflections that hinted at deeper feeling. Observers would later remark that the balance between composure and visible frustration was delicate, almost theatrical in its restraint, but entirely real in its effect. And the emotional tension was compounded by the presence of the judge. Judge Matthew Nicklin, by all accounts, approached the proceedings with careful impartiality, maintaining procedural rigor while subtly reminding all parties that the courtroom is a domain of law above sentiment. Every clarification, every ruling, every gentle redirection of the questioning reinforced the boundaries within which Harry, for all his history and prominence, had to operate. And yet, this framework, the rigid structure of judicial process, only heightened the emotional stakes. When emotion collides with procedure, every reaction is magnified. Every subtle gesture becomes a signal. Every pause becomes a point of suspense. Consider this. The moment Harry reacted to the refusal of the royal title was not just a personal flair. It was a microcosm of the trial itself, a series of contrasts, contradictions, and tensions. He is simultaneously a public figure and a private individual, bound by expectations of composure, yet confronted with provocation, seeking justice, yet constrained by procedural norms. The courtroom amplifies these dualities, creating a stage on which both legal arguments and human emotion play out in parallel. And if we move beyond the immediate courtroom, there is another layer. Media coverage of the trial is relentless. Headlines dissect every nuance, every raised eyebrow, every shift in tone. Social media commentary adds a secondary layer of scrutiny, often amplifying perception over substance. In this environment, the courtroom is not isolated. It is both contained and magnified, each moment echoing outward into a public narrative that is unpredictable and uncontrollable. The stakes, therefore, are both intensely personal and broadly symbolic. Harry's reactions, his visible frustration, his measured testimony, his confrontation with procedural limits, signal to the world something about how he understands his place within society. They suggest a tension between inherited privilege and personal agency, between expectation and autonomy. They hint at the complexities of navigating life as a figure defined by both tradition and modern scrutiny. And yet, these signals are subtle, requiring careful attention to decode. They are not shouted headlines. They are quiet currents beneath the surface of visible action. And here is a paradox that will persist throughout this trial. The very act of seeking justice exposes vulnerability. Harry's legal action, intended to protect his privacy and assert boundaries, also places him under unprecedented scrutiny. Every motion in court, every word spoken, every reaction is recorded, interpreted, and broadcast. The legal shield simultaneously creates a spotlight. The courtroom, designed to adjudicate facts, becomes a stage on which personal narrative, public expectation, and legal argument intertwine. Pause for a moment to reflect. What does this tell us about power, authority, and recognition. A man born into extraordinary privilege, yet subject to the same procedural norms as anyone else. A life shaped by ceremony and expectation, yet challenged by legal and emotional realities that cannot be commanded or controlled. A trial that is ostensibly about information gathering becomes a lens into the broader tensions between society, media, and individual agency. And even as the first day of testimony closed, the courtroom was left with an unresolved tension. The refusal to address Harry as Your Highness was a procedural point, yes, but it was also a signal. A subtle, persistent reminder that in the theater of law, no one is exempt, no matter their title, their history, or the weight of public attention. And for Harry, that signal carried emotional weight, signaling boundaries, limits, and the stark reality of accountability within the legal framework. Yet, the audience is left with a question that lingers beyond the courtroom walls. How will this collision of protocol, emotion, and legal argument unfold over the coming weeks? How will? Most striking realization of all, even the smallest gestures, the way a title was withheld, the way a pause was held, the way a reaction flickered across a face, could become seismic within this environment. Because here, in the High Court, every detail mattered, and every detail would ripple outward, shaping the narrative far beyond the courtroom itself. And what came next, in the days and weeks following that first confrontation over recognition, would escalate beyond expectation. And no one could predict the full consequences. The courtroom doors had closed, but the story had already escaped. Before Harry even took his seat on the witness stand, headlines were forming, tweets were circulating, and news alerts pinged across devices worldwide. Within minutes, the refusal to address him as Your Highness had become a focal point, a soundbite distilled from the complexity of the trial into something visceral and immediate. And it was only the beginning. Outside the High Court, the media ecosystem had gone into overdrive. Cameras, microphones, and reporters lined the pavement, capturing the comings and goings of legal teams, witnesses, and spectators. Photographers jockeyed for angles, hoping to capture subtle expressions, a flick of the eye, a clenched jaw, a hesitation before entering the building. Every gesture was analyzed, framed, and interpreted before the ink had dried on the morning newspapers. Social media added a new, relentless dimension. Within minutes, snippets of testimony were quoted, videos of the courtroom entrance were shared, and commentators, both professional and amateur, began constructing narratives. Some framed Harry as indignant, perhaps even petulant. Others saw the refusal of the title as an affront, a deliberate act of subtle disrespect toward a man who had already endured years of media scrutiny. And somewhere in the middle were the legal analysts, parsing what could be said, what could not, and what might be implied. It's worth asking, how much does this external pressure affect what happens inside the courtroom? For the average person, a trial unfolds in a contained, almost clinical space. But for someone in Harry's position, whose life has been dissected and broadcast for decades, the courtroom is never isolated. The presence of the media, both inside and outside, becomes a force in its own right, shaping behavior, influencing perceptions, and adding a layer of tension that is impossible to ignore. Inside the courtroom, the dynamic was intense. Legal teams worked methodically, but the pressure was palpable. The Daily Mail's defense lawyers were prepared, anticipating every angle, ready to challenge every assertion. Their approach was meticulous, almost surgical. Emphasize legality, highlight absence of complaints at the time, frame stories as responsible journalism. Each statement was carefully measured to counter not just the substance of Harry's allegations, but also the broader narrative that had already begun to circulate. Harry, meanwhile, had to navigate multiple realities at once. He was recounting events, presenting evidence, and responding to questions, all while knowing that every word could be amplified, misinterpreted, or weaponized by a press corps eager for sensation. The psychological load was enormous. He had to maintain composure, articulate claims clearly, and anticipate lines of questioning, all under the unblinking gaze of cameras and a global audience. Yet even in this intense environment, there were moments of human vulnerability. Observers later described fleeting expressions, a brief tightening of the shoulders, a subtle exhale, a downward glance. These were not dramatic outbursts. They were micro-moments that revealed the weight of the experience. It was a reminder that even a prince, accustomed to scrutiny and expectation, was still human, still susceptible to stress, still deeply affected by the proceedings. And the media coverage only amplified this duality. Every moment of visible tension, every subtle reaction, became fodder for public debate. Headlines painted a spectrum of narratives: the aggrieved royal, the man seeking justice, the figure resisting accountability, the subject of entitlement. The speed and intensity of this coverage created a feedback loop. What happened in court influenced public perception, which in turn exerted pressure back onto the courtroom actors, consciously or unconsciously shaping their behavior. Then there was the question of historical context. Some of the reporting that Harry challenged stretched back 20 years or more. Stories published in the late 1990s and early 2000s formed the backdrop for legal arguments in 2026. To many, the relevance of such old material might seem questionable. But for Harry, the impact was cumulative. These were not isolated articles. They were part of a sustained pattern that affected his life, his family, and his sense of privacy. And the media's framing often ignored this nuance, reducing decades of experience to single, digestible narratives that fit neatly into a headline. The complexity of this context created another tension: the legal versus the emotional. The court had to focus on legality. Was information obtained unlawfully? Did it constitute a breach of privacy? Were the actions of journalists justified? The emotional narrative, however, was equally powerful. The sense of invasion, the erosion of personal boundaries, the indignity of being treated as a commodity by the press. Harry's testimony had to bridge these worlds, grounding his claims in law while also conveying the human toll that accompanied decades of scrutiny. Consider, too, the strategy of the defense. The Daily Mail was not merely defending past actions. They were defending the legitimacy of journalism itself. Their statements emphasized responsible reporting, legitimate sources, and absence of complaints at the time. Implicitly, this was a claim not just against Harry but against the idea that public figures could claim perpetual protection from scrutiny. Every legal argument carried broader cultural significance: the boundaries of privacy, the obligations of journalists, and the responsibilities of those in power. And yet, even as the defense framed their case meticulously, cracks in the narrative appeared. Testimony revealed inconsistencies in reporting, questions about how information had been obtained, and potential gray areas in journalistic practice. Each revelation added complexity, undermining the neat narratives presented in press statements, and forcing the public, and the courtroom, to grapple with ambiguity rather than simple certainty. In this environment, every gesture mattered. The media scrutinized not just words but expressions, body language, pauses, and tone. Every moment of tension became material for analysis. And this, in turn, intensified the stakes inside the courtroom. Harry was acutely aware that any lapse, any misstep, could be amplified, reframed, and circulated globally within hours. The psychological burden of being both subject and observer of one's own public image created a unique tension, one that few outside the royal sphere could fully comprehend. The interplay between courtroom procedure and media pressure was magnified further by social media. Clips from the proceedings, whether official or leaked, circulated almost immediately. Commentary ranged from sympathetic to critical, factual to speculative, serious to sensational. The digital age had created a form of omnipresent observation. No testimony occurred in isolation, and no reaction was private. This dynamic shaped not only public perception but also the trial's rhythm, as all parties were acutely aware of the ever-watchful audience. And within that awareness, subtle strategies emerged. Harry's legal team had to calibrate testimony to withstand scrutiny, not just from the judge, but from a global audience. Defense counsel had to anticipate public interpretation while constructing arguments strictly within legal parameters. Journalists, meanwhile, interpreted and framed every exchange, sometimes amplifying minor procedural points into major talking points. Every moment was a node in a vast network of narrative influence. Yet, amid this complexity, Harry maintained a careful balance. There was visible frustration, certainly, at procedural limitations and the refusal to use his title, but it was tempered by composure, by awareness of the stakes, and by a disciplined approach to testimony. The contrast between the visible and the controlled created a dynamic tension that was almost cinematic. A man accustomed to attention, negotiating authority, recognition, and personal integrity under the microscope of law and media combined. It's also critical to note the broader context. This trial was more than just a legal contest. It was a cultural flashpoint, a lens through which questions about privacy, media responsibility, and the treatment of public figures were being refracted for a global audience. Harry's confrontation with the press, his challenge to decades-old stories, and the courtroom dynamics were all part of a narrative that extended beyond the High Court. A story about accountability, fairness, and the invisible pressures of fame. And even as the days unfolded, the tension between media framing and courtroom reality intensified. Every procedural point, every objection, every line of questioning became a potential narrative pivot. Reporters dissected testimony, commentators speculated on emotional cues, and social media amplified interpretations. The trial became a theater not just of law, but of perception, memory, and public judgment. Yet, despite this cacophony of attention, the court itself remained a space of focused deliberation. Judge Nicklin maintained control with calm authority, emphasizing process and legal principle. Every ruling, every clarification, every measured instruction served as a reminder that the courtroom operated according to its own logic, one that did not bend to public opinion, social media pressure, or celebrity status. And it was precisely this juxtaposition, the public spectacle versus the procedural rigor, that heightened the drama. The question then emerges for observers. How does one navigate the collision of intense media scrutiny with the strictures of law? How does a prince, accustomed to public recognition and ceremonial authority, maintain composure while asserting legal rights against a powerful media institution? And how does every reaction, spoken, unspoken, or interpreted, contribute to a narrative that will outlast the trial itself? Because what came next, how the media continued to amplify, distort, and contextualize every court interaction, would not only influence public perception, but would also subtly shape the unfolding legal strategy, the demeanor of witnesses, and the broader stakes of a trial that had already begun to feel like a collision of worlds, law, legacy, and media in constant tension. And in the midst of this storm, Harry's next moves, every line of testimony, every controlled display of frustration or composure, would carry consequences far beyond the walls of the High Court, consequences that would challenge assumptions, provoke debate, and leave lingering questions about the intersection of privacy, power, and public life. What happened next, how the courtroom battle and the media frenzy intertwined, would escalate in ways that no one outside that room could fully anticipate. And the ripple effects, subtle at first but increasingly powerful, were only just beginning to unfold. When the second week of testimony began, the courtroom atmosphere had already hardened into something tense, almost electric. The initial shock of the title dispute had passed, but its reverberations remained. Everyone present, the judge, the lawyers, the witnesses, the public observers, was acutely aware that what unfolded here was not simply a question of legality, but of narrative, perception, and the subtle dynamics of power. From the outset, Harry's legal team made a strategic choice. They would not merely recount past intrusions. They would meticulously reconstruct them, presenting a timeline that stretched back decades, highlighting patterns, motives, and methods. It was an approach that demanded patience, precision, and a careful balance between legal argument and human impact. The courtroom, in response, became a stage for slow-burn revelation, each detail deliberately revealed, each pause pregnant with meaning, each testimony layered with implication. The early evidence was striking. Documents, internal memos, and correspondence from the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday painted a picture that, on the surface, seemed mundane. Journalists following leads, sourcing contacts, preparing articles. Yet, as the legal team unraveled the threads, subtle contradictions emerged. Certain memos suggested active encouragement to pursue information aggressively, hints that investigative boundaries may have been stretched. At first glance, these were nuances, easily overlooked by the untrained eye. But to a court and an audience attuned to implications, they were suggestive. Even more compelling were the testimonies of witnesses who had interacted directly with the newspaper's journalists. Their recollections varied, some precise, some hazy, but all revealed glimpses of the mechanisms used to gather private information. What appeared procedural and professional in print became in practice a network of techniques that skirted ethical lines, leaving an impression of relentless pursuit, of curiosity transformed into intrusion. The evidence, layered and detailed, began to challenge the publisher's assertion that all reporting was responsible and legitimate. And yet, the defense remained composed. Their approach was methodical. Question credibility, emphasize gaps in memory, underscore procedural compliance, and highlight the absence of complaints at the time. They framed every disputed detail as either inconsequential or legally permissible, reinforcing the narrative that decades-old reporting cannot retroactively constitute a violation. In doing so, they introduced tension between legality and morality, highlighting the challenge Harry faced, proving harm in a framework that emphasized rules over emotional reality. But here, the tension deepened. The very structure of evidence presentation allowed subtle human drama to surface. When Harry described specific articles, moments of intrusion, and the psychological toll, he did so with measured control, yet occasionally his composure faltered. A sigh, a tightening of the hands, a brief pause that conveyed more than words ever could. The courtroom, already attuned to nuance, sensed these signals immediately. They were amplified not only by those present but by the outside media, which seized upon the slightest displays of emotion as indicative of personal truth, frustration, or indignation. Consider this. In a typical civil trial, the focus would be largely technical, analytical. But in this case, the intersection of celebrity, royalty, and media scrutiny transformed the evidence into something almost cinematic. Every document, every testimony, every procedural objection was filtered through multiple lenses: the law, personal narrative, and the global audience. The smallest inconsistency could be magnified into a major talking point. The quietest sigh could be framed as outrage or indignation. The courtroom, in effect, became a theater of perception as much as a tribunal of law. Even as the legal arguments unfolded, Harry's team was mindful of one key element: human impact. They highlighted not only the act of reporting, but the effects of exposure. How private moments, conversations, struggles, personal tragedies had been transformed into public material. How the cumulative effect of repeated intrusion shaped mental well-being, family dynamics, and the ability to navigate public life. It was a subtle, yet critical, narrative layer, demonstrating that legality does not negate human cost. And here, a direct question emerges for the audience. When decades-old reporting is scrutinized through modern sensibilities, how should we measure accountability? Is it enough that no legal complaint existed at the time, or does the enduring effect of exposure create a different moral calculus? The trial was rapidly becoming a lens through which broader societal questions about privacy, power, and media ethics could be examined. The defense, of course, anticipated these moves. They argued that personal impact cannot retroactively criminalize actions that were lawful when undertaken. They emphasized the journalistic principles at play: sourcing, verification, and public interest. Each legal point was interwoven with cultural framing, positioning the newspaper not merely as a defendant in a civil case, but as a defender of press freedom against what they characterized as a challenge rooted in privilege and expectation. But as testimony progressed, cracks began to appear. Certain correspondences and internal notes hinted at targeted efforts that were aggressive, persistent, and, at times, invasive. These details suggested a willingness to press boundaries that blurred the lines between legitimate investigation and intrusion. The jury, the judge, and observers could sense that beneath the procedural defense lay ambiguities, moral gray areas, and operational choices that might not align with the publisher's stated commitment to responsible journalism. And even more revealing were the inconsistencies in the publisher's narrative. Public statements emphasized legality, yet the documents sometimes reflected informal directions, internal debates over methods, and discussions of strategies that prioritized sensational impact over ethical restraint. The tension between public representation and internal practice became a subtle but powerful element of the trial, adding layers of complexity to what otherwise might have been interpreted as straightforward reporting. Meanwhile, Harry's composure, though generally maintained, occasionally revealed glimpses of the personal stakes. When recounting particularly invasive stories, brief flashes of frustration or restrained anger surfaced. A slight tremor in his voice, a deliberate pause, an almost imperceptible narrowing of the eyes, all captured by the courtroom observers and immediately translated by the media into narratives of indignation and resolve. It was, in many ways, an unintentional but compelling display of the emotional dimension of privacy violations. This interplay between emotion and evidence raised profound questions. Can the legal system account for harm that is intangible, cumulative, and psychological? How does one quantify invasion of privacy when the damage is ongoing, subtle, and interwoven with the public's fascination with celebrity? These were not questions with easy answers, and they added layers of tension to an already high-stakes proceeding. Complicating matters further, the trial also introduced strategic legal maneuvers designed to challenge credibility. Defense counsel questioned the timing of complaints, the selection of evidence, and the motivations of witnesses. Each question was calibrated to create doubt, to shift attention, and to frame Harry's case as reactive rather than proactive. It was a chess match, in which every testimony and document served as a piece to be maneuvered, challenged, or defended. And yet, for all the legal precision, the human story remained front and center. Observers noted that Harry's ability to maintain composure while recounting deeply personal experiences underscored both the gravity of the allegations and the discipline required to navigate such a complex environment. His testimony conveyed not only facts, but an undercurrent of lived experience, bridging the gap between legal abstraction and human reality. Every day in court became a study in contrasts: calm and tension, legality and emotion, public perception and private experience. Each new piece of evidence, each line of questioning, added to a narrative that was unfolding in real time, revealing not just the specifics of alleged intrusion, but also the broader dynamics of media power, public expectation, and individual resilience. And as the early evidence was laid bare, as contradictions emerged and subtle tensions built, it became clear that this was not a trial that would resolve neatly or quickly. The courtroom was a living, breathing entity, shaped by every action and reaction, every word spoken and unsaid, every gesture interpreted and amplified. And for Harry, every moment was a negotiation, not only of legal argument, but of personal dignity, emotional endurance, and public perception. But what happened next? How deeper lines of evidence began to reveal previously hidden interactions, the internal communications that suggested a more calculated pursuit of private information, and the responses from both sides that would escalate tension to unprecedented levels, would change the trajectory of the trial entirely. And no one could have predicted how far these revelations would ripple, far beyond the high court and into the world watching every moment. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. A memo here, an internal email there, a seemingly innocuous note that, at first glance, could be dismissed as routine office correspondence. But when examined in sequence, a pattern emerged, a shadow network of communication that suggested something more calculated, more deliberate, and, at times, morally ambiguous. The evidence was painstakingly introduced by Harry's legal team. It was not flashy. There were no dramatic revelations shouted from the bench. Instead, the documents were methodical, precise, almost clinical in presentation. Yet beneath the sterile words lay the implications, a newspaper that prided itself on investigative rigor, yet possibly willing to skirt the line between legitimate reporting and intrusion. One email, dated more than a decade ago, outlined an internal debate about pursuing information on a particularly sensitive personal matter. The wording was careful, almost perfunctory. Investigate thoroughly, but maintain plausible deniability. The phrase, seemingly innocuous, carried an undertone that would not be lost on the court, or the audience watching the proceedings unfold in real time through reporting and social media. It suggested a conscious awareness of the legal and ethical boundaries, and yet a willingness to push against them. Another memo discussed sources, contacts, and the methods by which information could be obtained discreetly. The language was professional, technical even, but the subtext was unmistakable. The pursuit of private information was being treated as a strategic operation rather than a simple matter of journalistic reporting. It painted a portrait of an organization adept at navigating the gray areas between legality and exposure, between investigation and intrusion. These documents were just the beginning. As more internal communications were introduced, a narrative began to take shape. There were discussions of timing, when to release certain stories, which events might generate maximum impact, and how to handle potential pushback. There were debates about phrasing, framing, and context, all suggesting a calculated approach that went beyond mere reporting. And there were notes on how previous actions had gone unnoticed, or at least unchallenged, hinting at an institutional understanding of privilege, access, and consequence. What made this particularly striking was the contrast between these internal communications and the public-facing statements issued by the publisher. Officially, they maintained that all reporting was responsible, grounded in legitimate sources, and free of unlawful activity. Internally, however, the documents revealed a level of tactical planning, prioritization, and attention to human vulnerability that complicated this narrative. The contradiction was subtle but significant. Words that promised responsibility publicly were paired with strategies that suggested opportunism privately. Harry's legal team, with careful precision, highlighted these inconsistencies. They pointed to passages that emphasized discretion, noting the potential ethical implications of targeting personal matters, even when technically legal. The judge, ever attentive, allowed these subtleties to unfold without commentary, understanding that the weight of the evidence lay not only in what was written, but in the patterns, omissions, and intentionalities that the documents implied. The human element of this evidence became immediately apparent. While the memos themselves were impersonal, their effect on the courtroom was anything but. Harry's testimony, juxtaposed against these communications, conveyed a lived reality. A life scrutinized, a privacy repeatedly compromised, a family exposed to public narrative without consent. Every reference to these documents was layered with emotional resonance, drawing the courtroom and the global audience into a story that was at once legal and deeply personal. And yet, the defense remained resolute. They argued that the documents, when read in full context, did not indicate any unlawful activity. They emphasized journalistic freedom, the norms of investigative reporting, and the distinction between aggressive pursuit and illegality. Every argument was designed to frame Harry's allegations as reactive, emphasizing that strategic internal communications do not inherently equate to wrongdoing. Still, the tension was undeniable. The documents suggested intent, planning, and awareness of potential consequences. They exposed a level of calculation that made the ethical questions unavoidable. How far should a journalist go to obtain a story? What constitutes reasonable discretion versus invasive pursuit? And when actions intersect with the lives of public figures, how do we balance accountability, legality, and moral responsibility? The courtroom became a crucible for these questions. Observers noted that even small procedural interactions, objections, clarifications, the timing of evidence submission, took on amplified significance. Each nuance could be interpreted as signaling broader intent, or as exposing gaps in strategy or judgment. The process was deliberate, meticulous, and designed to allow these subtleties to emerge gradually, amplifying suspense and curiosity both within the courtroom and for the global audience following the story. As the trial progressed, another layer of complexity emerged, the interplay between strategy and perception. The publisher's legal team aimed not only to defend past actions, but to shape future interpretation. By framing evidence, questioning witnesses, and emphasizing lawful practice, they sought to control the narrative before public perception could fill in gaps. Harry's team, conversely, sought to demonstrate a pattern of behavior, using internal communications as evidence of deliberate pursuit, ethical oversight, or potential overreach. The tension between these approaches created a dynamic rhythm: push, counter, anticipate, reveal, a cadence that kept both the court and the public continually engaged. And then there were the minor, yet telling, details: notes on timing, the prioritization of stories, the assessment of risk, all seemingly small, procedural matters that, when viewed together, suggested an operational mindset focused on leverage, advantage, and impact. These subtleties were emphasized by Harry's team to demonstrate the contrast between claimed responsibility and practiced approach, creating a slow-burn narrative tension that unfolded with every document and testimony. Consider, too, the psychological weight of these revelations. For Harry, each memo was more than evidence. It was a reminder of intrusion, of personal boundaries violated, and of a life constantly surveilled. Even controlled, measured, and composed testimony could not entirely mask the human toll. And for observers, the documents provided a lens into systems of power, strategy, and ethical negotiation that operate largely unseen behind the public-facing facade of journalism. The paradox deepened. The more meticulous the reporting, the more precise the documentation, the greater the potential for these materials to undermine the narrative of responsible journalism. Planning, foresight, and internal debate, hallmarks of professional media practice, could simultaneously be read as evidence of calculation, opportunism, or intentional disregard for privacy. The ambiguity was unavoidable, the stakes heightened, and the courtroom's slow-burn drama intensified. Then came the first critical challenge. Witness testimony aligned with the internal communications suggested discrepancies in how decisions were described publicly versus what occurred behind closed doors. Certain journalists admitted that internal guidance emphasized outcomes over ethical deliberation, or that strategies prioritized access and exclusivity rather than accuracy or sensitivity. Each admission, measured and careful, reinforced the emerging narrative that while legality might have been maintained, ethical and personal boundaries had, at times, been blurred. And as the court absorbed this juxtaposition, documents suggesting intent, testimony suggesting implementation, and public statements suggesting restraint, a tension emerged that no single party could entirely control. The narrative was no longer confined to the courtroom. It was leaking outward, shaping perception, framing debate, and complicating assumptions about both the prince and the publisher. This is where the subtle genius of trial narrative becomes apparent. It is not the loudest moments that define perception, but the cumulative effect of small contradictions, controlled admissions, and the tension between claimed and observed behavior. For Harry, these moments validated the human reality behind the legal argument, that intrusion, even if technically lawful, carries consequences that extend far beyond the written page. And yet, the publisher's defense remained vigilant. They emphasized lawful boundaries, journalistic norms, and the absence of complaints. They sought to reframe the narrative in terms of procedure, precedent, and public interest. Each intervention reminded the court and the audience that legality and morality do not always align, and that the law, not sentiment, ultimately governs outcomes. But the cracks were showing. Even within carefully controlled arguments, patterns became visible. Internal communications suggested planning that exceeded necessity, strategic targeting that bordered on obsession, and awareness of sensitivity that was sometimes overridden by pursuit of advantage. The tension between the controlled image of journalism and the subtle evidence of aggressive pursuit created a slow-burn suspense that kept observers on edge, eager to see which lines of argument would ultimately prevail. And as the days of evidence presentation stretched into weeks, it became increasingly clear that the trial was not merely about privacy or legality. It was about perception, about narrative, about the interplay between human experience and institutional behavior. Every memo, every email, every strategic note offered insight into systems of power operating in the shadows, hinting at broader truths that extended beyond the individuals in the courtroom. But even as these patterns emerged, the trial was far from resolved. The documents and communications had introduced new questions, revealed potential inconsistencies, and set the stage for the next escalation. How would the publisher respond to these revelations? How would Harry navigate the tension between legal precision and personal indignation? And what hidden layers of strategy and intent had yet to surface? What came next? The emergence of previously undisclosed communications that could redefine both strategy and perception was about to take the trial into uncharted territory. And no one, not the judge, not the lawyers, and certainly not the global audience, could have anticipated the full scope of what was about to be revealed. The courtroom had settled into a rhythm, but the tension had not diminished. In fact, it had only thickened, like a slow, inexorable storm pressing down on everyone present. The initial shock of the title dispute and the early evidence had given way to a more insidious pressure, contradictions, subtle yet undeniable, between what the publisher had claimed publicly and what the internal communications now suggested privately. It began with a statement made months before the trial. Publicly, the Daily Mail had insisted that all reporting was lawful, responsible, and based on legitimate sources. Privately, emails and memos suggested a more calculated approach. Journalists were instructed to pursue stories with maximum impact, to identify high-value targets, and to exploit opportunities that might cross ethical boundaries if necessary. The difference between the public narrative and private strategy was stark, and the courtroom felt it immediately. Harry's legal team seized on these contradictions with precision. They juxtaposed the public statements against the internal emails, highlighting the tension between the two. Each comparison was deliberate. A statement declaring lawful and responsible journalism, followed by a memo advocating aggressive investigation, subtle intimidation of sources, or the exploitation of personal information. The pattern was unmistakable. The courtroom, and the global audience following minute-by-minute coverage, could see the emerging story, a media institution presenting a carefully curated image to the public while operating under very different internal directives. What made this especially striking was the context. These were not minor, isolated incidents. The communications spanned years, even decades, suggesting an institutional approach that prioritized access, exclusivity, and narrative advantage over ethical consistency. The implications were profound. If internal guidance encouraged strategies that skirted ethical boundaries, then public statements claiming restraint and responsibility could be seen as misleading or incomplete. The contradiction was subtle, yet damning in its cumulative effect, and the human dimension could not be ignored. Harry, speaking to these patterns, conveyed not just facts, but lived experience. Every article, every exposure of private matters, every instance of intrusion was part of a broader pattern that affected him personally and emotionally. His testimony bridged the gap between abstract documents and human impact. Each contradiction highlighted in court was not merely a point of legal contention. It was a reflection of the ongoing violation of privacy and dignity that defined much of his public life. The publisher's defense responded methodically. They emphasized that documents must be read in context, that strategic discussions are part of normal journalistic operations, and that aggressive pursuit does not equate to illegality. Their argument rested on technicalities. No law was broken, no direct complaint had been filed at the time, and the pursuit of public interest stories was a legitimate function of journalism. They framed the contradictions as operational nuance, not ethical lapse. Yet, despite these defenses, the tension persisted. Internal communications showed planning, timing, and prioritization that suggested calculated decisions aimed at maximizing personal exposure. The contrast between internal operational language and external public claims created a dissonance that was difficult to reconcile. Observers noted that the courtroom itself seemed to respond to this tension. The air thickened with anticipation, subtle gestures were amplified, and even minor reactions became meaningful signals. Then came the most dramatic revelation of the session, a chain of emails discussing the timing of sensitive stories. The correspondence indicated that certain articles were released to coincide with personal events in Harry's life, moments of family significance, personal milestones, or public appearances. The emails discussed audience attention, anticipated reactions, and the potential to generate maximum impact. The public-facing narrative suggested careful reporting, while the internal communications revealed calculated timing designed to influence perception and public reaction. The courtroom absorbed this in silence. Judge Nicklin allowed the evidence to speak for itself, understanding that the significance lay not only in the content, but in the broader implications, strategy, intent, and human consequence. The subtle, almost imperceptible contradictions became a focal point, highlighting the tension between professional claims and operational reality. For Harry, these revelations were both validation and provocation. Validation, because they confirmed what he had long suspected, a pattern of intrusion that exceeded mere journalistic curiosity. Provocation, because the documents revealed a level of deliberation that suggested awareness of potential harm, a kind of calculated indifference. Each email, memo, and note reinforced the narrative that he was confronting not random reporting, but a sustained, strategically executed series of actions aimed at his private life. The defense, sensing the impact, attempted to reframe the narrative once again. They argued that correspondence about strategy or timing is standard in media organizations, necessary to maintain competitiveness and accuracy. They emphasized professional norms, editorial discretion, and operational logistics. Every counterargument was precise, controlled, and designed to reassert the publisher's narrative of legitimacy. Yet the contradictions had already left an impression. Internal planning versus public statements, strategic pursuit versus claimed restraint. These disparities created a tension that could not be fully mitigated by legal argument. The courtroom, the press, and the global audience had all witnessed the emerging disconnect, and the subtle drama of this tension became a story in itself. And then there was the psychological dimension. Harry, recounting the impact of these actions, brought the human element into sharp relief. Articles timed to coincide with personal milestones were not neutral events. They were experienced as invasive, disruptive, and deeply personal. The contradiction between professional presentation and lived experience underscored the stakes. Legality aside, the ethical and emotional dimensions were undeniable. Observers began to speculate on broader implications. If the internal communications suggested deliberate targeting, strategic planning, and calculated timing, could they also imply awareness of potential legal or ethical risks? And if so, what does that say about the publisher's public insistence on responsibility and legality? These were questions without easy answers, and they added layers of suspense to an already charged trial environment. Even small details were magnified. The choice of words in emails, the tone of memos, the emphasis on audience reaction, all became evidence of intent, illustrating the complex interplay between operational strategy and human consequence. The contrast between what was promised to the public and what was practiced internally became a recurring theme, shaping not only legal argument, but the emotional arc of the trial itself. For the audience, the slow unraveling of contradictions created a narrative rhythm. Revelation, tension, reflection, escalation. Each piece of a vide.